Close your eyes and imagine a city filled with wealth, power, and grandeur, but underneath, it's rotting. The leaders are corrupt, justice is for sale, and the people have turned away from what once made them strong. Sounds familiar? This isn't just a modern-day story. This was Judah in the time of Isaiah. At first glance, Judah seemed like it was thriving. The temple stood tall in Jerusalem, and religious festivals were still held. But if you looked closer, you'd see the cracks, a nation pretending to be holy while rotting from the inside. Isaiah was born into this world, a time of political instability, religious hypocrisy, and moral decay. The once great kingdom of David and Solomon was now divided, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. The northern kingdom had already started falling into chaos, and Judah was heading in the same direction. But the people didn't care. They still went to the temple, still offered sacrifices, still called themselves God's chosen people. They believed as long as they performed the rituals, they were safe. Isaiah saw the truth. They were only going through the motions. Their hearts were far from God, and they were blind to the disaster that was coming. Judah had one job: to be different, to be a light among the nations. Instead, they started looking just like everyone else. The rich grew richer by exploiting the poor. The judges took bribes. The priests, who were supposed to be spiritual leaders, became corrupt politicians. Even the kings made alliances with pagan nations, putting their trust in foreign armies instead of God. Isaiah called them out. Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 23. This wasn't just about politics, it was about a nation that had abandoned its identity. Judah was supposed to be different, set apart, but now, they were no better than the nations they once looked down on. And that's when Isaiah stood up. Isaiah wasn't just another prophet. He didn't sugarcoat things. He didn't give feel-good messages. He spoke the truth, even when it made people uncomfortable. Imagine standing in the middle of a powerful city, surrounded by the elite, and saying, your sacrifices mean nothing. Your prayers are empty. God is tired of your fake worship. That's exactly what Isaiah did. He wasn't afraid to call out the hypocrisy. He told the people, you bring offerings to the temple, but you oppress the poor. You pray to God, but your hands are full of blood. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 15. Can you imagine how people reacted? The religious leaders hated him. The politicians wanted him silenced. No one wanted to hear the truth. But Isaiah didn't stop. He warned them, if you don't change, disaster is coming. If you keep ignoring justice, your nation will fall. If you don't return to God, you will lose everything. People probably rolled their eyes. Isaiah, you're too extreme. Everything is fine. But it wasn't. While Judah was busy playing politics, the powerful empire of Assyria was growing stronger. They had already destroyed several kingdoms. Isaiah saw the storm coming, but no one listened. He told them, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees. What will you do on the day of reckoning? Isaiah chapter 10 verses 1 to 3. But instead of repenting, they laughed. Instead of humbling themselves, they became even more corrupt. And isn't that how it is today? We see warning signs, but we ignore them. Let's be real, this isn't just about ancient Judah. How different are we today? How often do we see injustice and stay silent? How often do we put more trust in wealth, power, or governments than in what's right? Isaiah's story isn't just history. It's a mirror. It's a warning to every generation. If a nation turns away from truth, if people ignore justice, if faith becomes just an empty ritual, destruction follows. So here's a question for you. Right finger, do you think our world today is similar to Judah in Isaiah's time? Right finger, do people still ignore truth and corruption, just like they did back then? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're still watching, hit that like button and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this. Your support. Isaiah wasn't just another prophet. He wasn't someone who preached feel-good messages or told people what they wanted to hear. He spoke the truth, no matter the cost. In a time when people valued comfort over conviction, he stood alone, calling out the sins of an entire nation. He walked through the streets of Jerusalem, seeing the hypocrisy firsthand, priests who performed sacrifices in the temple while secretly making deals with corrupt rulers, judges who accepted bribes while claiming to uphold justice, and kings who claimed to follow God while forming alliances with pagan nations. To the people of Judah, everything seemed fine. The temple was still standing. The city still bustled with life. Festivals were still celebrated, but Isaiah saw through the illusion. He saw a nation that had turned faith into a performance, where religious rituals were more about appearance than devotion. And he wasn't afraid to say it. Your sacrifices mean nothing. He warned them. Your prayers are empty. God is tired of your fake worship. He wasn't speaking to people who had completely abandoned their faith. He was speaking to people who thought they were righteous, who believed that as long as they followed traditions, they were safe. But Isaiah saw what they refused to admit: their faith was hollow. They prayed in the temple but cheated their neighbors. They made offerings to God but ignored the cries of the poor. People didn't want to hear it. No one likes being told they're wrong, especially when they believe they're doing everything right. The religious leaders hated him. The wealthy and powerful despised him. Even ordinary people, those who had been swept up in the culture of complacency, wanted him to stop. But he wouldn't. He couldn't. He had seen the truth. And he knew the danger that lay ahead if Judah didn't change. Isaiah wasn't just speaking against corruption, he was warning of consequences. He saw where Judah was headed, and it terrified him. The people had placed their trust in military alliances, in wealth, in politics, but they had forgotten the one thing that had truly set them apart: their relationship with God. Isaiah told them plainly, "You think you are safe, but destruction is coming. Your cities will burn. Your enemies will conquer you. You will be taken into exile." Instead of listening, they mocked him. They dismissed him as a doomsayer, someone who was out of touch with reality. After all, Judah had survived many threats before. The temple still stood. The city was still strong. Why should they believe this one man who kept saying things no one wanted to hear? But Isaiah wasn't just another voice in the crowd. He had been given a vision. He had seen the holiness of God, the true majesty of the Almighty. He had been in the presence of divine power, and that experience had changed him forever. He understood something that the people of Judah refused to see. God wasn't looking for empty words or meaningless rituals. He wanted hearts that were truly devoted, lives that reflected justice, mercy, and humility. The more Isaiah spoke, the more resistance he faced. People began to turn against him. They whispered that he was too extreme, that his message was too harsh. They accused him of trying to tear the nation apart instead of helping it. Some even began to call him a traitor. But Isaiah didn't stop. He knew that his message wasn't just for them, it was for the future. He was writing for the generations to come, for those who would one day look back and realize that he had been right. And that's the thing about truth. It's rarely popular in the moment. People resist it, fight against it, try to silence it, but truth doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. Isaiah understood this. He knew he might not live to see the fulfillment of his words. But he also knew that one day, history would prove him right. Now, here's a question for you. If someone like Isaiah were alive today, would we listen to him? Or would we dismiss him the same way the people of Judah did? Would we call him too radical, too negative, too out of touch? Or would we recognize the truth, even if it was uncomfortable? Isaiah had always known that the world around him was broken. He had seen the corruption in the city, the false piety of the religious leaders, the way people worshiped with their mouths but lived in complete opposition to what they claimed to believe. But no matter how much he saw, no matter how deeply he understood the moral decay of his nation, nothing could have prepared him for what happened the day he stepped into the temple and had a vision that would change his life forever. It was a day like any other. Or at least that's what Isaiah must have thought when he entered the temple courts. Perhaps he had come to pray. Perhaps he had come to seek guidance. Maybe, just maybe, he was already questioning how much more he could take, how much longer he could keep calling out the sins of Judah when no one seemed to listen. But whatever his expectations had been, they were shattered in an instant. Without warning, the heavens seemed to open. And before him, he saw something that no human eyes were meant to witness. There, high above, was a throne unlike any earthly throne. And upon it sat the Lord, exalted and majestic, his robe filling the entire temple. The sight was overwhelming, but it was only the beginning. Around the throne, Isaiah saw creatures he had never encountered before: seraphim, celestial beings with 6 wings each. With 2 wings, they covered their faces, as if even they could not bear to look directly upon the Almighty. With 2 wings, they covered their feet, a sign of humility, and with the final 2, they hovered, prepared to carry out the will of the one who sat on the throne. Then, they spoke, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, the whole earth is full of His glory." The sound of their voices was like thunder, shaking the very foundations of the temple. Smoke filled the air, and Isaiah, for all his strength and courage, was undone. Up until this moment, Isaiah had been a prophet who pointed out the sins of others. He had called out kings, priests, and commoners alike. He had told Judah of its hypocrisy, its empty worship, its corruption. But here, standing in the presence of God Himself, Isaiah saw something that terrified him more than anything he had ever spoken against. He saw himself. All his words, all his prophecies, all his righteous anger melted away in an instant. Because now, in the light of true holiness, he understood just how unclean he was. "Woe to me," he cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." This was not just fear. It was complete and utter despair. He wasn't simply afraid that he might die, he knew that he deserved to. Every imperfection, every failure, every hidden fault was laid bare before the all-seeing eyes of God. How could someone like him, stained and unworthy, stand before the one who was perfect in every way? But then, something happened that Isaiah could never have expected. One of the seraphim flew toward him, carrying a burning coal taken from the altar. Isaiah must have flinched, knowing that fire symbolized judgment, purification, something no human could withstand. But the seraph did not strike him down. Instead, the angel touched the coal to Isaiah's lips and spoke words that would change the course of his life. "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." Just like that, everything changed. Isaiah had thought he was beyond saving. He had stood in the presence of perfect holiness and believed that his story had come to an end. But God had other plans. He didn't destroy Isaiah, He cleansed him. He didn't reject Isaiah, He prepared him. Then, for the first time, Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord Himself. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" It's hard to say how long Isaiah hesitated, if he hesitated at all. Perhaps there was a moment where he thought about the weight of what was being asked. Perhaps, in the back of his mind, he knew that accepting this call would mean hardship, rejection, and eventually, death. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because now, Isaiah was no longer just a man. He was a messenger. He had been cleansed, called, and chosen. And so, without fear, without hesitation, he responded with the words that would define the rest of his life. "Here am I, send me." Isaiah's vision wasn't just about him. It was about what happens when someone truly encounters God. It wasn't about religion, or tradition, or saying the right words. It was about standing in the presence of holiness and understanding, in the deepest part of your soul, that you are completely unworthy and yet, somehow, being chosen anyway. But Isaiah's mission would not be easy. In fact, God warned him from the start that the people wouldn't listen. "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding, be ever seeing, but never perceiving." Isaiah was not being sent to change people's hearts. He was being sent to deliver the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. Can you imagine being given a mission like that? To be told that no matter how hard you try, people will reject you? That no matter how true your words are, most will refuse to listen? That your entire life's work will be ignored by the very people you are trying to save? Most of us would walk away. Most of us would say, "What's the point?" But Isaiah didn't. He accepted the call, knowing it would cost him everything. And here's the thing. Isaiah's message wasn't just for Judah. It wasn't just for his time. His vision, his words, his warnings, they are still speaking today. Because we, too, live in a world that is filled with corruption. We, too, see people who go through the motions of faith without truly understanding it. We, too, have moments where we feel unworthy, broken, beyond redemption. But Isaiah's vision tells us something else as well. It tells us that no one is too far gone. That no matter how unclean we are, no matter how undeserving, God is still calling. That even when the world refuses to listen, truth must still be spoken. So here's the question. If you were in Isaiah's place, if you stood before the throne of God and heard His voice calling, would you have the courage to say, "Here am I, send me"? Judah had always seen itself as the chosen nation, the kingdom that carried God's promise. Its people believed they were invincible, that no disaster could truly touch them because the temple of the Lord stood in Jerusalem. They had the law, the traditions, the bloodline of David. They had survived wars, threats, and invasions before. So, when Isaiah warned them that their downfall was coming, that their enemies would soon overtake them, they laughed. They ignored him, convinced that he was just another voice of doom. But Isaiah saw what they refused to see. He had warned them again and again. God wasn't looking for rituals or empty prayers. He wanted a nation that pursued justice, righteousness, and faithfulness. Yet, Judah continued in its corruption. The rich exploited the poor. The leaders used their power for personal gain. And the priests turned worship into nothing more than a transaction. Every warning from God was dismissed. Every call to repentance was ignored. At first, things seemed fine. Judah still stood. The economy was still moving. The temple was still in place. But beneath the surface, cracks had formed, and judgment was already on its way. While Judah trusted in its alliances with foreign nations, its greatest enemy was growing stronger, the mighty Babylonian Empire. An unstoppable force waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Isaiah had warned them about making alliances with pagan nations, about trusting in human strength rather than God. He had spoken out against the political leaders who relied on Egypt and Assyria for military protection instead of turning back to their Creator. But Judah didn't listen. It believed that military strategy and diplomacy could save it. It believed that no matter what, God would never let them fall. They were wrong. When Babylon set its sights on Judah, it wasn't just another military campaign, it was judgment in motion. The very things Isaiah had spoken about were now happening before their eyes. First came the warnings, the minor invasions, the demands for tribute. Judah paid, thinking it could buy peace. But peace never comes through compromise with corruption. Every deal Judah made only made Babylon bolder. And then, the day of reckoning came. The Babylonian army surrounded Jerusalem, cutting off supplies, starving the people inside. The mighty city, the pride of Judah, now stood helpless. Its once glorious streets became filled with desperation. Its people weak from hunger. Its leaders scrambling for a way out. Where were their allies now? Where were the nations they had put their trust in? No one came to save them. The siege lasted for months. And with each passing day, the suffering grew worse. Mothers watched their children die from hunger. The wealthy, who had once ignored the cries of the poor, now begged for scraps. The priests, who had been so sure of their safety, now prayed for a miracle that would not come. And then, the walls fell. The Babylonian soldiers stormed the city, setting fire to its homes, its palaces, its temple. The very building where the people of Judah had placed their false sense of security was now in flames. Its golden treasures stolen, its sacred artifacts carried away to a foreign land. The streets ran red with blood. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Those who surrendered were taken captive. The once mighty nation of Judah was no more. It had been reduced to ashes. Its people scattered, its identity shattered. Isaiah had spoken the truth all along. He had warned them that their arrogance, their refusal to repent, would lead to this very moment. But now, it was too late. The nation that thought it was too great to fall had collapsed under the weight of its own rebellion. But even in the midst of destruction, Isaiah's words carried a deeper meaning. Because he had not only spoken of judgment, he had also spoken of hope. He had foretold a time when God would restore what had been lost. When a remnant of his people would return. When a new kingdom, greater than Judah had ever been, would rise. This wasn't just about exile. It was about learning a painful lesson. No nation, no kingdom, no power on earth can stand if it turns away from truth and justice. Judah had been chosen, yes, but that did not make it immune to consequences. And that's where this story speaks to us today. Because Judah's downfall isn't just ancient history, it's a warning. A warning that even the strongest nations can crumble when they forget their purpose. A warning that no amount of wealth, power, or influence can save a people who have abandoned their foundations. The question is, do we see the warning signs in our own world? Do we recognize the cracks forming beneath the surface? Or are we just like Judah, thinking we're untouchable, ignoring every call to change? History repeats itself when we refuse to learn from it. Judah's rebellion led to its downfall. What path are we on today? When King Hezekiah died, there was still hope that Judah might change its course. He had been a ruler who, despite his flaws, sought God and attempted to guide the nation toward righteousness. But his death marked the beginning of a dark and terrifying chapter in Judah's history. His son, Manasseh, took the throne, and with him came one of the most ruthless, godless reigns the kingdom had ever seen. Manasseh wasn't just a bad king. He was a complete reversal of everything his father had stood for. If Hezekiah had worked to bring Judah closer to God, Manasseh worked twice as hard to erase every trace of faith. Under his rule, the streets of Jerusalem ran red with innocent blood, and the temple, once the sacred dwelling place of God's presence, was turned into a place of pagan worship. The first thing Manasseh did was reintroduce every form of idolatry imaginable. He built altars to Baal, worshipped the stars, and even set up an idol inside the very temple of God. The sacred laws that had been given to protect Judah's identity were cast aside. He actively encouraged witchcraft, sorcery, and fortune-telling, practices that had been strictly forbidden. And if that weren't enough, he did something even more horrifying. He sacrificed his own son in fire as an offering to pagan gods. This was more than just rebellion, it was outright defiance. Manasseh wasn't simply sinning in secret, he was making a public statement. He wasn't just turning away from God, he was leading the entire nation into darkness. And the people followed. They abandoned the ways of their ancestors and embraced the new era of corruption. Seduced by the king's example. But not everyone stayed silent. There were still voices that called for righteousness. Prophets who refused to let Judah slip away without a warning. Isaiah was one of them. He had spent years preaching against the sins of the nation, warning them that destruction was inevitable if they did not turn back. But Manasseh had no interest in listening. Unlike previous kings who had at least tolerated the presence of prophets, Manasseh wanted them gone. He unleashed a reign of terror against anyone who opposed him. Priests, elders, and prophets were hunted down and executed. Tradition holds that even Isaiah, the great prophet who had served under multiple kings, was finally captured under Manasseh's orders. And his death was not quick. According to ancient accounts, Isaiah was sawn in half. A brutal execution meant to silence him forever. The blood of the innocent filled the city, and fear gripped the people. Speaking out against the king was a death sentence. Those who had once followed the ways of the Lord either hid in fear or gave in to the new order. With every passing year, Judah sank deeper into spiritual decay. But what Manasseh failed to understand was that no matter how powerful he was, no matter how much blood he spilled, truth could not be erased. God had been patient with Judah. But this was a breaking point. The sins of Manasseh were too great, and their consequences would not be ignored. Though Manasseh ruled for decades, though he had built himself an empire of corruption, his kingdom was already doomed. The destruction of Judah was no longer a warning, it was a certainty. The people had gone too far, and judgment was coming. Manasseh thought he was untouchable. But the same God he had rejected, the same truth he had tried to erase, would one day bring him to his knees. No kingdom built on injustice and bloodshed lasts forever. And in the end, Manasseh would learn this the hard way. The question is, how often do we make the same mistake? How often do people believe they can act without consequences? That they can rewrite truth, silence those who stand for what is right, and get away with it? But history, time and time again, proves otherwise. What do you think? Could Manasseh have changed his fate if he had listened? Could Judah have been saved? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Isaiah had spent decades warning the people of Judah, pleading with them to return to God, to abandon their corrupt ways before it was too late. He had stood before kings, rebuked priests, and challenged the powerful without fear. He had delivered prophecies of both judgment and hope, speaking of the destruction that would come if the people refused to change, but also of a future redemption, of a time when a faithful remnant would be restored. But by the end of his life, Isaiah was no longer just a prophet delivering messages. He had become a hunted man. The rise of King Manasseh had turned Jerusalem into a city of bloodshed. The righteous were silenced, and the wicked grew bold. Under Manasseh's rule, the worship of false gods wasn't just tolerated, it was enforced. Pagan altars were built in every corner of the city. Inside the temple itself, the law of Moses was no longer taught, and anyone who dared to oppose the king's reforms was seen as an enemy. Manasseh's hatred wasn't just directed at foreign threats or rival nations. It was aimed at his own people, at those who refused to bow to his new order. And Isaiah was at the top of that list. Isaiah had always known that his message would not be popular. He had been mocked, ignored, and dismissed. But under Manasseh, the consequences were far worse than rejection. Prophets weren't just ridiculed, they were hunted. The streets of Jerusalem were no longer safe for those who remained faithful to God. Those who spoke against the king disappeared in the night. Some were dragged from their homes. Others executed publicly as a warning. Fear spread through the city. And yet, despite it all, Isaiah refused to be silent. He knew that the people had turned against him. The same city where he had once preached freely now saw him as an enemy. Many who had once respected him now avoided him, afraid that even being seen with the prophet would bring punishment. But Isaiah didn't run. He continued to speak. He continued to warn. He continued to proclaim that Judah's sins would lead to destruction. That no alliance, no army, no false god could save them from the judgment that was coming. His words spread, reaching even the ears of Manasseh himself. The king, furious, declared that Isaiah must die. There are ancient traditions that tell of what happened next. Isaiah, now an old man, fled into the wilderness, seeking refuge. Some say he hid in the hills. Others that he found shelter in a forest outside the city. But wherever he went, the king's men pursued him. Manasseh was determined to erase every trace of his words, to wipe out his warnings, to silence him forever. Eventually, Isaiah was found. Some accounts say he had taken refuge in the hollow of a great tree, hoping to escape detection. But his enemies were relentless. When they discovered his hiding place, they did not drag him out, nor did they grant him a swift death. Instead, they ordered that the tree be cut down, with Isaiah still inside. It was a slow, brutal execution. The prophet who had seen visions of the Lord, who had spoken of a coming Messiah, who had warned Judah with everything in him, was now being sawed in half. It was a death meant not just to kill, but to erase. But Isaiah's voice did not die that day. Manasseh believed that by destroying the prophet, he could destroy the message. But he was wrong. The words of Isaiah had already been spoken. The prophecies had already been written. And long after Manasseh's reign came to an end, long after Judah itself fell and was taken into exile, Isaiah's words remained. Centuries later, when the Jewish people sat in Babylon as captives, it was Isaiah's writings that gave them hope. When they longed for restoration, it was Isaiah's prophecies that reminded them of God's promise. And when a man named Jesus of Nazareth stood up in a synagogue and declared that he had come to fulfill what the prophets had written, it was Isaiah's words that he read aloud. Isaiah's death was tragic, but his legacy was unstoppable. His betrayal by his own people was painful, but it did not erase the truth. And that's the power of truth. It does not die just because people refuse to hear it. And now, the question remains, what would we do in Isaiah's place? Would we speak the truth even when it costs us everything? Or would we stay silent, afraid of what others might do? History remembers Isaiah, not because he lived a comfortable life, but because he was willing to stand firm, even when the world turned against him. What do you think? Would Isaiah's fate have been different if the people had listened? Or was his death inevitable in a world that rejects truth? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Isaiah's enemies thought they had silenced him. King Manasseh, his executioners, and the people who had turned against him believed that once the prophet was gone, his message would die with him. But history tells a different story. Isaiah's death was brutal, but his words lived on. His prophecies, once ignored or mocked, became the foundation of hope for generations to come. When Judah fell to Babylon and its people were dragged into exile, it was Isaiah's writings that reminded them they were not forgotten. When they sat in a foreign land, wondering if they would ever see Jerusalem again, Isaiah's voice whispered through the centuries, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God." Isaiah chapter 40 verse 1. It's one thing to be a prophet who predicts disaster. It's another to be the one who also speaks of restoration. Isaiah's message was never just about judgment. He had warned of destruction. Yes, but he had also painted a vision of something greater, a day when exile would end, when the faithful remnant would return, when a new covenant would be made. Even in the darkest times, his words gave people a reason to believe that the story of Judah wasn't over. But Isaiah's legacy wasn't just about the return from exile. His most powerful prophecies pointed far beyond Babylon, beyond Judah's immediate future. He spoke of someone yet to come, a servant who would suffer, who would bear the sins of many, who would bring salvation not just to Israel, but to the entire world. Centuries later, when Jesus walked into a synagogue and was handed the scroll of Isaiah, he read aloud, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free." Then he rolled up the scroll and said, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Isaiah had seen it long before anyone else. He had glimpsed the coming of the Messiah, the one who would fulfill everything Judah had failed to be. His words were not just about the past, they were about the future. A future where God's plan for redemption would unfold. And so, the prophet who had been rejected, hunted, and executed became one of the most quoted voices in all of Scripture. His writings shaped not just the faith of Israel, but the entire foundation of Christianity. His words were echoed by Jesus, by the apostles, by believers throughout history. The lesson is clear. Truth cannot be destroyed. People can reject it, fight it, even try to kill the messenger, but in the end, truth endures. Isaiah's life is proof that standing for what is right, even at great personal cost, is never in vain. So now, the question turns to us. What will our legacy be? Will we stand for what is true, even when it's unpopular? Will we speak out, even when the world turns against us? Isaiah's story isn't just about the past, it's about every generation that must decide whether to follow truth or silence it. What do you think? Why do some voices, like Isaiah's, endure while others fade? Let me know in the comments.